Every woman in Red Hollow had tried to win Cole Mercer, and every one of them had failed. He was the kind of man the frontier made only once, hard as iron, quiet as stone, built from years of drought and loss and betrayal. The widows brought their best smiles, their finest cooking, their softest words. He turned them all away without blinking. Then a plain, unremarkable girl arrived with a single bag and no explanations. And within one brutal winter, she did what no beauty ever could. She made him need someone. This is her story. If you stay until the end, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Evelyn Hart to Red Hollow arrived on a Tuesday morning so cold the horse's breath hung in the air like smoke. She was the last passenger to climb down, and she did it quietly. No announcement, no scanning of the crowd, no checking whether anyone had come to meet her. She simply stepped off the wagon, set her bag on the frozen ground, and looked at the town the way a person looks at something they've already decided to endure. Red Hollow wasn't a welcoming place, even on its best days. It sat in the middle of a wide valley that caught wind from three directions and mercy from none. The main street was a stretch of mud that froze solid in October and stayed that way until April, and the buildings along it had the look of structures that had survived more than they'd been built for. Warped wood, low roof lines, signs faded past reading. There was a general store run by a man named Hargrove, who charged frontier prices and apologized to no one, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that served bad whiskey and provided worse conversation, and a livery stable that smelled exactly the way you'd expect. A church sat at the eastern end of town, squat and practical, its bell long since cracked and replaced by nothing. The people who lived there were the kind who'd come looking for land or opportunity and found instead that survival was the only available occupation. They'd learned to be skeptical of newcomers, especially quiet ones. A person who didn't explain themselves was either hiding something or carrying something they hadn't sorted out yet, and neither was particularly welcome. Evelyn Hart looked like she might be carrying both. She was 24 years old, though she could have passed for older. Not old in the face. Her features were even enough. A straight nose, dark eyes that held their expression carefully, but old in the way she moved, steady and economical without wasted motion. She was thin from real scarcity, not fashion, and her clothes were plain almost to the point of severity. A gray wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, a dress the color of old leaves, and boots that had been resoled at least once. Her hair was dark brown and pulled back without particular care. She wore no jewelry, not even a ring. Nobody came to help her with her bag. She picked it up herself and walked down the main street with her eyes forward, taking in the town without appearing to study it. She stopped at Hargrove's general store, pushed the door open, and went inside. Hargrove was behind the counter, making notes in a ledger. He was a heavy-set man with small eyes and a way of looking at customers that made them feel they were already behind on some debt. He glanced up when she entered, took in her coat and her bag and her lack of a companion, and went back to his ledger. "Help you?" "I'm looking for work," Evelyn said. Her voice was even, no particular accent. "And a room. I heard there might be something available near the Calhoun homestead." Hargrove looked up again, more carefully this time. "Martha Calhoun's place? Her husband died last spring. She's been managing alone." "I know, I wrote to her. She said she had work in a room in the barn she'd fixed up." He studied her for a moment. "You got family here?" "No." "Friends?" "Not yet." He seemed to find this answer either honest or insufficient, and went back to his ledger. "Calhoun Place is 2 miles east. Stay on the main road until you see the red fence post. Can't miss it. Fence is the only thing on that land still painted." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and left. She was halfway down the street when she first saw Cole Mercer. He was coming out of the livery stable, pulling on work gloves, talking over his shoulder to the stable hand about something that seemed to require more words than the stable hand was willing to provide. Cole Mercer was the kind of man you noticed before you meant to. Not because of height exactly, though he was tall enough, but because of the way he occupied space. There was a density to him, a sense that he had settled into himself and wasn't going anywhere. He was broad through the shoulders, narrow in everything else, with a face that had been weathered the honest way, by working outside in every season rather than spending dramatic afternoons on horseback. His jaw was heavy. His eyes were the kind of pale gray that reads as cold until you look long enough to see it's just careful, and he moved with the automatic precision of someone who had done hard work long enough that hard work had become his natural state. He was 36 years old. He had owned the Mercer Ranch for 11 years, first alongside his father, and then alone after his father's heart gave out. He ran 400 head of cattle on 800 acres, employed 3 hands year-round and 2 more in the season, and was, by any reasonable measurement, the most successful man in Red Hollow. He was also the most unavailable. The widows of the territory had tested this unavailability thoroughly and scientifically. Clara Voss, who was generally agreed to be the prettiest woman within 40 miles, had made her intentions clear over the course of a spring and received nothing but polite deflection. Helen Marsh, whose late husband had left her a going homestead and a reputation for excellent cooking, had brought pies to the Mercer Ranch twice, and each time found Cole occupied with something that couldn't wait. Agnes Drummond, who was sharp and funny and had been widowed young enough that she'd had time to grow into exactly the kind of woman she wanted to be, had engaged Cole in a conversation at the Dusty Boot that lasted 2 hours and ended with him saying goodnight in a tone that conveyed no intention of a sequel. The town had discussed these failures at length and arrived at several explanations. Some said Cole was still mourning a woman he'd loved before he came to Red Hollow, though nobody could confirm the details. Some said he'd made a decision to stay alone after watching his father work himself to death providing for a family. Some said he was simply too used to his own company to want anyone else's. Old Pete Granger, who spent most of his days on the bench outside the Dusty Boot and considered himself the valley's chief philosopher, said it most simply. That man has built himself a wall, not mean about it, just done. None of them were entirely right. Cole Mercer's reasons were his own, and he had never explained them, and he didn't intend to. He was still talking to the stable hand when Evelyn walked past with her bag. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. She continued east toward the red fence post, and Cole Mercer went back to managing his operation, and for the next several weeks, those two facts remained unconnected. Martha Calhoun was 51 years old and had the kind of constitution that made people half her age feel inadequate. She had come to Red Hollow as a young bride, built a homestead with her husband through 2 droughts and a fire, raised 3 children, buried one of them, and kept the place running for 8 months after her husband died before she admitted she needed help. She admitted it the way most self-sufficient people admit they need help, reluctantly and with conditions. The room in the barn was small and clean, with a cot, a stove, and a single window that looked east toward the pasture. It smelled like hay and pine pitch and cold air. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it the way she'd looked at the town, steady, assessing, making a decision somewhere behind her eyes. "It's not much," Martha said. She was watching Evelyn the way you watch a person when you've agreed to trust them and you're waiting to see if the agreement was a mistake. "It's more than I need," Evelyn said. "It's fine." Martha relaxed slightly. "Work starts at 5. Chickens first, then the cow, then whatever the day requires. I'll feed you twice. If you're sick, you tell me. Don't push through it and make yourself useless for 3 days. I don't have patience for heroics." "That's fair." "I pay in meals in the room. If the season goes well, there's a little money. If it doesn't—" She stopped. If it didn't go well was not something she'd worked out completely. "We'll figure it out." "All right," Evelyn said. "You're not going to ask me what happened to my husband?" "No." "Most people ask. They want the story." "You'll tell me if you want me to know," Evelyn said. "Otherwise, it's your business." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Dinner's at 6," and went back to the house. Evelyn set her bag on the cot and sat beside it. Through the small window, she could see the pasture, and beyond it, the hills going dark against the winter sky. The cot was narrow, but the mattress was decent. The stove worked. The latch on the door had been recently replaced. She thought, this will do. She had thought that before, in places that ended up being harder than they looked. But she thought it again anyway, because the alternative, to anticipate how things might go wrong, was an indulgence she had decided early she couldn't afford. The first weeks at the Calhoun place were exactly what Evelyn had expected: cold, physical, and unrelenting. The work started in darkness and ended in darkness, and the hours between were filled with the particular kind of labor that frontier living required. Not dramatic, not especially skilled, but constant. Chickens. The cow, whose name was apparently Gert and who had strong opinions about being milked before she was ready, fence lines that needed checking, water troughs that needed breaking through the morning ice, feed that needed to be hauled from the barn to wherever it was needed. Martha worked beside her, directing without explaining more than necessary, which suited Evelyn exactly. What Evelyn did without being asked, she noticed what needed doing and did it. The post on the east fence was leaning. She reset it on a Thursday afternoon without mentioning it to Martha. The hinge on the chicken coop door had been rubbing and would fail by spring. She found a spare hinge in the barn and replaced it on a Saturday morning before Martha was up. The woodpile was getting low on the split stuff. She spent an evening with the axe. Martha noticed all of it and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then one evening over dinner, she looked up and said, "You don't talk much." "Not if there's nothing to say," Evelyn said. "Most people feel quiet with something." "I know. I just don't see the point." Martha went back to her stew for a moment. Then she said, "The man at the hardware store, Hargrove, told me a woman came through asking about you, said you'd come from Casper." "That's right." "He said she seemed interested in knowing where you'd gone." Evelyn looked up from her bowl. Her face didn't change much, but something in it shifted, the way water shifts when something passes beneath the surface. "What did you tell him?" "I hadn't spoken to him yet. I'm telling you now so you can decide what you want me to say if someone asks." There was a silence. The stove ticked in the cold. "You could say you don't know," Evelyn said. "That would be honest. You don't know much." "I know enough," Martha said. "But that's my business, like you said." She picked up her spoon and went back to her dinner. Evelyn did the same. Neither of them mentioned it again. It was in the second month, when a freeze came through that dropped the temperature to 15 below for 6 straight days, that Red Hollow started to show the cracks that hard winters reveal. 3 families on the northern edge of the valley abandoned their homesteads. They packed what they could carry and went south, leaving the rest to whatever might want it. The Hendersons lost a third of their cattle to a fence failure that let the herd drift overnight and exposed them to the open. Old Pete Granger's pipes froze, and the damage cost him 2 days of warmth while he begged borrowed heat from neighbors. The Dusty Boot ran short on wood and started limiting hours, which was the frontier equivalent of an institution showing its frailty. Martha Calhoun's place held, partly because of her own long experience, and partly because Evelyn had, without being asked, spent the week before the cold hit doing the things that made the difference. Banking the foundation with hay bales, reinforcing the barn door against wind, checking the water system for weak points, and stacking 3 weeks' worth of split wood under the overhang where it would stay dry. When the freeze came, the Calhoun animals were warmer than most, the water flowed longer, and the household was inconvenienced but not damaged. Martha didn't say anything about it, but she stopped watching Evelyn with the specific wariness of someone waiting to be disappointed. It was during the freeze that Evelyn first interacted with Cole Mercer. The occasion was a busted wagon. One of Cole's hands, a young man named Danny Pratt, who was good with horses and bad at most other things, had tried to take a load of supplies through the shortcut across the ridge and had misjudged the ice on the road. The wagon had slid, dropped a wheel into a ditch, and cracked an axle. Danny was unhurt but stuck, 3 miles from the Mercer ranch, with 2 days of provisions that needed to get home before they froze solid, and a horse that wasn't built for pulling a broken wagon out of a ditch. Evelyn found him on her way back from checking the east fence line. She'd taken that route because the wind was worse on the main road, and she'd learned to minimize exposure. And she came up over the rise and found Danny Pratt sitting on the seat of his tilted wagon, looking like a man who had run out of ideas. "You need help," she said. "Ma'am." He took off his hat, which was an instinct rather than an appropriate social response given the circumstances. "I can't get the wheel out, and even if I could, the axle, I see it." She walked around the wagon, crouching to look at the axle, putting her hand on the wheel. The axle wasn't shattered, just cracked through on one side. "You've got rope?" "In the back." "Drive stake under the wheel, take the tension off the axle. Then we can get the wheel out without snapping it the rest of the way. You got anything to brace with? Board? Fence rail?" "There's a board I was bringing back for the barn." "Get it." They worked for 40 minutes in the cold. It was awkward and slow, and her hands went numb enough twice that she had to stop and breathe on them, and Danny Pratt turned out to be more useful than he looked once someone told him what to do. They got the wheel out of the ditch, braced the axle enough that the wagon could move without the crack opening fully, and redistributed the load so the weight rode on the intact side. "You can get it home if you go slow and don't hit anything," Evelyn told him. "Have someone look at it tonight. You'll need a proper repair before you load it again." Danny stared at her. "How did you know to do that?" "My father had wagons," she said, and started back toward the Calhoun place. She was 100 yards away when he called after her. "What's your name?" She told him and kept walking. Danny Pratt went home and told Cole Mercer exactly what had happened, with the kind of detailed retelling that young men do when they've been surprised by something and haven't processed it yet. Cole listened while he checked the axle himself and confirmed the assessment. It was cracked clean through on the side, would need a full replacement. And then he said, "She work at the Calhoun place?" "Yes, sir. Just arrived last month, I think." He ran his thumb along the crack and thought about nothing in particular. Then he said, "Get Mitchell to look at this in the morning," and went inside. He did not think about Evelyn Hart again that evening, or if he did, he didn't notice. Cole Mercer had owned the Mercer Ranch alone for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had made every decision himself and answered to no one, which suited him. He was not a man who found solitude difficult. He found it, if anything, more honest than company. You knew where you stood when you were by yourself, which was more than he could say for most social arrangements. He had not always been alone. There had been a woman, years ago, back in the period before Red Hollow, before the ranch, when he'd been young enough to believe that wanting something was sufficient reason to expect it. Her name had been Anna, and she had been kind and smart and genuinely fond of him, and they had lasted 2 years before she told him, with the gentleness of someone who has thought carefully about what they're about to say, that she couldn't spend her life waiting for him to let her in. He hadn't known what she meant when she said it. He had a better understanding now. After Anna, there had been no one serious, not because he was opposed to the idea, or bitter, or carrying a wound he nursed in private. None of those dramatic explanations. More because he had tried once and come up short, and the ranch required everything he had, and the people who'd shown interest since had wanted something that he couldn't honestly say he was offering. He'd rather be alone than dishonest about that. What he hadn't anticipated was that being alone for long enough starts to feel like the natural order. You stop asking yourself what you're missing. You stop, after a while, even noticing the question. He ran his ranch with precision and loyalty. He paid his hands fair wages and held them to high expectations. He participated in the community the way a self-sufficient man participates. At the edges, present when needed, absent when not. He had a reputation for fairness and was known to be reliable in a crisis. He was not warm particularly, but he wasn't cold either. He was simply contained. A man who had put everything that wasn't the ranch in a place he'd stopped checking. The widows of Red Hollow read this containment as challenge. Cole had noticed and had not encouraged it, and had done his best to be clear without being unkind. He didn't think of himself as a prize or a puzzle. He thought of himself as a person who had made arrangements with his own life that didn't include being someone's project. In the 3rd month of winter, a stranger arrived in Red Hollow. His name was Leonard Hale, and he came with 2 things, money and a story about opportunity. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of city-made handsomeness that doesn't translate cleanly to frontier context, too well-dressed, too smooth, hair that sat too neatly against the cold. He wore a wool coat that cost more than most men in the valley earned in a season, and carried a briefcase that he handled with proprietary care. He took a room at the boarding house, and within 48 hours had introduced himself to every significant property owner in Red Hollow. His proposition, as delivered in conversations at the Dusty Boot, and across counters at Hargrove's and on front porches when the temperature allowed, was this. The valley was sitting on an opportunity that required investment to realize. He represented interests from back east who were looking to develop land in exactly this territory for purposes that would benefit everyone. A rail connection, he mentioned, without specifying the line, a consolidation of smaller claims into productive operation, jobs, infrastructure, the kind of change that comes when capital finds the right landscape. The story was smooth. It was designed to be smooth. Cole Mercer listened to it on a Thursday evening at the Dusty Boot, sitting at the end of the bar with a drink he wasn't finishing, and heard in it several things that didn't sit right. The vagueness about the rail line. Anyone doing legitimate rail business knew their line. The urgency, the way Hale mentioned that the window for this kind of deal was limited, that other valleys were being considered. The particular attention Hale paid to which families were struggling, which were in debt, which might be susceptible to an offer framed as rescue. Cole said nothing that evening. He watched Hale work the room and filed away what he observed. He wasn't the only one observing. Evelyn had seen men like Leonard Hale before. Not this man specifically, but the type. The kind who arrived with money and explanations and moved quickly because moving quickly was part of the mechanism. She'd grown up in a county where something similar had happened to her father's farm, a slow-motion disaster that dressed itself as opportunity until it was too late to refuse without already being ruined. She was in Hargrove's store buying flour when Hale came in to introduce himself to Hargrove, and she heard the conversation while pretending to check the bean supply on the far shelf. She heard the phrases Hale used: investment vehicle, consolidation of assets, favorable terms, limited time frame. She heard Hargrove respond with the flattery of a man who was interested but didn't want to appear too interested. She heard the word lean used once, quickly, in a context that made it sound incidental. She bought her flour and left. That evening she told Martha what she'd heard. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What kind of man was he?" "The kind who knows what to say," Evelyn said. "The kind where the words are right, but the order of them is wrong." "You think he's crooked?" "I think he's moving fast for a reason. Men with good deals don't rush." Martha got up and poured them both coffee. "There are families here who could be talked into almost anything, if it sounds like relief. The Hendersons lost a third of their cattle. The Wests have been behind on everything since the fall." "I know." They drank their coffee. The stove muttered in the corner. "What would he need?" Evelyn said. "To do this legally, take the land. A deed of trust, some kind of security agreement. People sign things when they're scared enough. Or when they don't read them carefully enough." "Or that," Martha agreed. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I'd like to look into him. Hale. I'd like to know who he is when he's not in this town." "How would you do that?" "Carefully," Evelyn said. "Slowly. I need to look at some public documents first. The courthouse in Laramie will have records." Martha looked at her. "That's a day's ride each way." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'll go on my day off." "In this cold?" "It's warmer than last week." Martha looked at her for a long moment, the way she did when she was deciding something. Then she said, "I'll lend you the good horse." The ride to Laramie was long and cold and largely miserable, which Evelyn had expected. The horse was good, as Martha had promised, a gray mare named Sal, who moved efficiently and didn't complain about the temperature, which gave her something in common with her rider. The courthouse records clerk in Laramie was a young man named Peters who appeared to find his job tedious and became visibly more interested when Evelyn explained what she was looking for. He pulled 3 boxes of documents and left her at a table by the window with a lamp and the recommendation that she start with the incorporation records. She spent 4 hours at that table. What she found was not explosive, not all at once. It was the kind of evidence that only looks like evidence when you know what you're looking at. A pattern of names appearing in adjacent documents, a company that had incorporated in 3 different territories under slightly different names, a string of land transactions in Wyoming and Colorado that had followed the same general shape. A speculator arrives, offers purchase or investment, obtains deeds of trust, forecloses when payments fall behind, resells at profit. In 2 cases, the local records mentioned legal challenges that went nowhere. In one case, there was a notation about a federal inquiry that appeared to have been dropped. Leonard Hale was not always named Leonard Hale. He had also been, in the Wyoming records, a man called L.H. Crane. Evelyn copied what she needed by hand, carefully and completely, into a small notebook she'd brought for the purpose. She thanked Peters, who seemed genuinely disappointed to see her go. She rode home in the dark, arriving at the Calhoun place after midnight, put Sal in the barn with extra feed, and went to bed without taking her coat off. In the morning, she reviewed her notes at the kitchen table while Martha watched her without asking questions. "Well," Martha said finally, when she couldn't stand it anymore. "He's done this before," Evelyn said. "4 times that I can find. The land ends up his. The people end up gone." Martha put her coffee down. "Lord." "The problem is the pattern is circumstantial. The names don't all match. A lawyer could argue coincidence." Evelyn looked at her notes. "What I need is something current, something that connects him to what he's doing here, not just what he's done before." "You're going to keep looking." "I'm going to keep looking," Evelyn agreed, "but carefully. If he knows someone's looking, he moves faster." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone else know you're doing this?" "No," Evelyn said. "Maybe someone should." Evelyn looked up. "Who?" Martha picked up her coffee. "There's a man in this valley who has enough land that Hale would need his cooperation to do what you're describing, and enough respect that if he stood up and said something, people would listen." She paused. "He also notices things. I've watched him. He notices things and says nothing, and I've always thought that was a waste." Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. "Cole Mercer." "He's not easy to approach," Martha said. "Keeps to himself." "I know," Evelyn said. She looked back down at her notebook. She thought about what it meant to ask for help, about all the ways that asking could go wrong. She thought about the Henderson family, the Wests, the 3 families who'd already abandoned their homesteads this winter because they had run out of options. She thought, "I can't do this alone." "I'll think about it," she said. But Cole Mercer knew something was wrong in Red Hollow, the way a man knows a fence is failing. Not because he's inspected it, but because the cattle are restless in a way they weren't last week, and the reasons for their restlessness have a logic if you trace it back far enough. He'd been watching Hale for 3 weeks, watching without apparent interest, the way he'd watch things he didn't trust, with his attention on adjacent information rather than the thing itself. He watched who Hale talked to and for how long. He watched which conversations ended with a handshake and which ended with people looking down at the ground. He noticed that Hale was spending a lot of time with Silas Marsh, the county land recorder, and that Marsh had started buying drinks for people at the Dusty Boot with money that didn't correspond to his salary. He noted that 2 families on the south end of the valley had quietly signed something. He didn't know what yet, and that both of them seemed relieved in a way that made him uneasy, the way people seem relieved when they've done something they're not going to look at too closely. He was building a picture, but he was building it without context, and he was aware that the missing context was the difference between an instinct and something you could act on. It was late February when Evelyn Hart came to the Mercer Ranch. She came on a Tuesday afternoon, on foot, wearing her mended coat, carrying nothing but the small notebook. She came around to the working entrance, the regular entrance, not the front door, and asked the hand who met her if Cole Mercer was on the property. Cole came out of the barn 10 minutes later, pulling off his gloves, finding her standing in the yard with a composure that struck him as either very confident or very accustomed to waiting. He'd seen her twice in passing since Danny's story, once at Hargrove's, once at the far edge of the main street. Both times she'd been occupied and had paid him no particular attention, which he'd noted only because it was unusual. "Miss Hart," he said. He remembered the name from Danny's account. "Mr. Mercer." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to show you something, if you have time. It won't take long, but it's important." He studied her for a moment. She didn't seem nervous exactly. She seemed braced, like a person who had decided on a course of action and was committed to it regardless of how it landed. "Come inside," he said. He took her to the kitchen, which was the only room that was adequately warm at that hour. He didn't offer coffee immediately, which was his way of seeing whether a guest had the patience to wait. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table without fidgeting and put her notebook in front of her and looked at him. He sat across from her and looked back. "Go ahead," he said. "I've been looking into Leonard Hale," she said. "The man who's been proposing investments to people in the valley. I went to the Laramie courthouse 3 weeks ago and looked at the public records." She opened the notebook and turned it to face him. "He's done this 4 times. Different names, different territories, same pattern." Cole pulled the notebook toward him and read. He read carefully and without comment, turning pages when he reached the end of them. His expression didn't change in a way that was easy to read, but she could see him working through it. The slight movement in the muscles around his jaw, the quality of his attention. He read for 15 minutes. Then he looked up. "Where did you get the time to do this?" he said. It was not the question she'd expected. "I made the time," she said. "I was worried. On Martha Calhoun's pay. She lent me the horse. I used my day off." A pause. "I'm not asking for anything. I wanted someone else to know what I know, and I wanted it to be someone who could do something with it." Cole closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. When he looked up, his expression was different, less assessed, more direct. "I've been watching him for a month," he said. "I didn't have what you have." "You've been watching longer than me." "Watching isn't the same as knowing." He leaned back in his chair. "The Marsh piece. That's new to me. And the incorporation records." He was quiet again. "This isn't enough to stop him." "I know. But it's a foundation." "Yes." He looked at her with an attention that was different from the assessment of the first minutes. More level, less interrogating. "What are you thinking in terms of a next step?" "I need to see the documents people have signed," she said. "The ones Hale is using here. I don't know yet if they're fraudulent or just predatory. There's a difference in terms of what can be done legally. You'd need someone to show you those documents. I'd need someone who signed one and would let me look," she said. "Or," she paused, "or what?" "Silas Marsh has the official copies, county recorder." She looked at Cole directly. If someone could get access to those records through official channels, through a legitimate inquiry, through someone who has enough standing that Marsh can't easily refuse. "Yes," she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she'd sat down, he allowed something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, a quality of recognition. "You figured out exactly what you needed," he said, "and then you came to the person who could provide it." "I don't have standing here," Evelyn said simply. "You do." "That's practical." "I'm a practical person." He studied her for a moment more. Then he stood up, went to the stove, and poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "Tell me what you know about the Wyoming cases," he said. "Everything, from the beginning. I want the full picture." She picked up the coffee and started talking. They were there for 2 hours. When she left, the winter afternoon had gone dark, and Cole stood in the yard and watched her walk down the road toward the Calhoun place, her coat a gray shape against the frozen track, her stride the same as when she'd arrived, steady, economical, not hurrying. He'd met a good many people in his years in Red Hollow. He'd learned, through experience and disappointment, to watch the gap between what people said and what they did, and to put his weight on the latter. He'd watched Evelyn Hart sit at his kitchen table for 2 hours, and he'd tried to find the gap, the angle, the ask that was under the ask, the thing she wanted that she hadn't said outright. He hadn't found it. She wanted to stop Leonard Hale from taking the Valley's land. That appeared to be exactly as much as it was. He went back inside and looked at the notes he'd made during their conversation, spread across the kitchen table. Then he put on his coat and went out to the barn, because the horses needed seeing to, and because thinking was easier when his hands were occupied. He thought about a woman who'd gone to Laramie on a cold day on her time off, alone, because she'd seen something she thought was wrong, and had decided to find out whether she was right. He thought, that is a person who does what she says. It wasn't a small thing. He'd lived long enough to know it wasn't a small thing at all. He picked up a brush and started on the nearest horse, and the animal shifted its weight and sighed, and the barn was warm and smelled like hay. And outside the wind came down from the north the way it always did in Red Hollow, steady and indifferent and entirely honest about what it was. Cole went to see Silas Marsh the next morning. He didn't announce it ahead of time, didn't send word, just rode into town before 8 and tied his horse in front of the county recorder's office and went inside. Marsh was at his desk sorting through a stack of documents with the careful slowness of a man who had learned to make simple work look complicated. He looked up when Cole came in, and something moved across his face. Not quite alarm, not quite guilt, but in the neighborhood of both. "Cole," he said, "didn't expect to see you." "Morning, Silas." Cole took off his hat and stood in front of the desk and didn't take the chair that Marsh gestured toward. Standing was clearer. "I need to look at some property filings. Recent ones. Anything involving transfer of interest or lien instruments in the valley. Say, last 60 days. Marsh's expression settled into something careful. "Those are public records. You've got a right to view them." "I know I do. That's why I'm here." A pause. Marsh set down his papers and folded his hands on the desk with the deliberateness of someone who'd decided to be cooperative rather than give Cole a reason to look harder. "I'll pull the box. Give me a few minutes." The box took 12 minutes, which Cole noted. When Marsh set it on the counter, Cole went through it methodically, pulling each document, reading it fully, setting it aside. He was looking for what Evelyn had told him to look for. Debt instruments disguised as investment agreements, deed of trust clauses buried in partnership language, acceleration provisions that allowed Hale's entity, whichever name it was using, to call the full amount due on 30 days' notice. He found 4 of them in the first 20 documents. He read them twice each. He was not a lawyer, but he dealt with enough land contracts over 11 years to know when language was designed to obscure rather than describe. These agreements were built to look like opportunity and function like traps. The payment terms were structured so that a family behind on anything, a single bad season, a sick animal, a medical expense, would miss their schedule and trigger the acceleration clause, at which point the debt became immediately due in full, which nobody in the valley could pay on 30 days' notice, which meant Hale's entity would move to foreclose on the collateral, which in every case was the land itself. He put the documents back and thanked Marsh and left. Marsh watched him go with an expression Cole didn't see but could have guessed at. He rode back toward the Mercer Ranch and took the long way, past the Henderson place and the Wests and the Calhoun homestead, and he looked at each of them as he passed. The fences, the smoke from the chimneys, the particular quality of maintained but struggling that characterized most of the valley's small operations in February. He thought about what it would look like in 6 months if Hale succeeded. He thought about empty buildings and stripped land and what it cost a community to lose its people one family at a time. He thought about Evelyn Hart at his kitchen table, laying out evidence with the methodical clarity of someone who'd learned the hard way that clarity is the only form of persuasion that doesn't eventually fail you. He turned his horse and rode toward the Calhoun place. Patem. She was in the yard repairing a section of fence when he rode up, a job that required driving new staples into a post that had softened with moisture and didn't want to hold them. She glanced up when she heard the horse, registered that it was Cole, and went back to the fence. He dismounted and tied the horse and walked over. "The agreements are deed of trust instruments," he said without preamble. 4 signed, possibly more I didn't see. The acceleration clause is buried in the 3rd paragraph of the payment section. She drove a staple and looked at the result critically. 30 days? 30 days. So all he needs is a bad season. She pulled on the wire to test the tension. Or a winter like this one. Yes. She set down the pliers and turned to face him. Her hands were red from the cold, and there was a smudge of rust on her cheek from the wire. "Did Marsh give you trouble?" "No, he was cooperative the way people are cooperative when they know you're going to look anyway, and they'd rather not give you a reason to look harder." "That's a kind of admission." "It is." Cole looked at the fence, at the repair she'd made, at the quality of the work. It was competent and careful, the kind of repair that would last. "I want to talk to the families who signed. Henderson and West for certain. I know them both. They won't want to admit they might have made a mistake. I know. I'll need to come at it sideways." He looked back at her. "I could use your notes. The ones from the Laramie records. If I can show them what he's done in other places before I ask them to look at what they signed here, the sequence matters." She was quiet for a moment. "If word gets back to Hale that people are questioning the agreements, he moves faster, I know. We'd need to be sure about Henderson and West before we approach them, sure that they won't go straight to Hale out of panic. Henderson won't. He's scared, but he's solid. West..." Cole paused. "West is harder to read." "Then Henderson first," Evelyn said, "and carefully." Cole nodded slowly. He was looking at her with an expression that held something he hadn't entirely decided to put into words. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "Why are you doing this? You've been in Red Hollow. What, 2 months? These aren't your people yet. You could walk away from this entirely and it wouldn't cost you anything." She looked at him steadily for a moment. The question didn't seem to surprise her, but she took her time with the answer, the way she seemed to take her time with most things that mattered. "My father signed something like this," she said. "When I was 16, a man came through with a similar story: investment, opportunity, partnership. My father was behind on the banknote, and it sounded like relief." She paused. "We were off the land in 14 months. "I'm sorry," Cole said. He meant it simply, not as a transition to something else. "It was a long time ago." She picked up the pliers again. "But I know what it looks like when it's starting, and I'm not going to stand next to it and say nothing." He watched her go back to the fence. She worked with the quiet competence of someone who didn't need to be watched to do things right, who would have done exactly the same repair whether or not anyone was there to observe it. "I'll go see Henderson tomorrow," Cole said. "I'd like you to come." She glanced up. "Me?" "You have the Laramie documents, and you're better at explaining the legal structure than I am." A pause. "Also, Henderson's wife reads people well. She'd trust you faster than she'd trust me, and I've known her for 8 years. Evelyn considered this. Then, "What time?" "After morning work. I'll come by for you." "All right," she said, and went back to the fence. The Henderson place was 4 miles north, on a stretch of land that had been productive before the cattle loss and was now sustaining itself on reduced margins, and Martha Henderson's extraordinary competence in stretching a household. Bill Henderson met them at the door with the particular wariness of a man who has been handling more than he can comfortably carry and has gotten used to keeping it to himself. He was perhaps 45, weathered in the way most valley men were, with honest eyes and a jaw he held a little too tight. "Cole," he said. Then he looked at Evelyn and didn't say anything, waiting for an introduction. "This is Evelyn Hart. She works with Martha Calhoun." Cole paused. "We need to talk to you about the agreement you signed with Leonard Hale, Kate." Bill Henderson's jaw got tighter. He looked at Cole for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let them in. His wife Ruth brought coffee without being asked. She was a compact, capable woman who listened the way sharp people listen, without interrupting, without showing agreement or disagreement until she'd heard the full shape of something. She sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn laid out the Laramie documents, and she read them carefully and didn't look up until she'd read them all the way through. Bill stood near the window with his arms crossed. He'd read the documents once, faster, and had gone quiet. "You're saying he's done this before," Ruth said. "4 times that I found," Evelyn said. "There may be more I couldn't access. The pattern is consistent. The same sequence, the same type of instrument. The families in these cases lost their land." "All of them?" "All of them in the Wyoming cases. One in Colorado filed a legal challenge. It went nowhere." Ruth looked at her husband. Something passed between them that was the particular language of a long marriage under pressure, compressed and specific. "The agreement we signed," Bill said slowly. "The acceleration clause." "You read it?" Cole asked. "I read the payment terms. I don't—" He stopped. "I didn't read the 3rd paragraph." "Not many people do," Evelyn said, without judgment. "It's drafted specifically so you wouldn't." Ruth said, "What happens if we can't make a payment?" "He calls the full amount due. 30 days. If you can't pay—" "We can't pay," Bill said flatly. "Not if he called the whole thing at once. Nobody could. Then he forecloses on the collateral." "Which is the land." Ruth's voice was level, but her hands on the table had gone still. In the way hands go still when the body is managing something the face isn't showing. "Yes," Evelyn said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the house in a low, persistent sound that had become so constant through the winter that people barely heard it anymore, except in moments like this. "What can we do?" Ruth said. It wasn't quite a question. "That depends on a few things," Evelyn said. "Do you still have the copy of what you signed?" "It's in the box in the bedroom." "I'd like to look at it. The document Hale gave you and the document at the recorder's office should match exactly. If they don't—" She glanced at Cole briefly. If they don't, that changes the picture considerably. Ruth stood and went to get it. While she was gone, Bill Henderson looked at Cole with an expression that mixed shame and anger in about equal measure. You think he changed the documents after we signed? I don't know yet. If he did, then we have something concrete, Cole said. If he didn't, we still have the pattern from the other territories. It's not nothing, but I won't tell you it's enough on its own. Bill looked at his hands. I told Ruth it was a good deal, he said quietly. I told her we'd be fine. Cole didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. The weight of having reassured someone and then found out you were wrong was one of the heavier weights a person could carry, and it didn't get lighter with sympathy. Ruth came back with the document and set it on the table. Evelyn put it beside her copy of the county recorder's version and read them side by side, slowly and completely, running her finger along each paragraph. She found the difference on the third page. Here, she said. She pointed to a clause in the Hendersons' copy that did not appear in the recorder's version, a provision that expanded the definition of default to include any reduction in the assessed value of the property, not just missed payments. It was 6 lines of dense language that, read carefully, meant Hale could call the agreement due if the land itself lost value for any reason, including natural causes, including the kind of cattle loss the Hendersons had already experienced. The recorder's copy didn't have it. Ruth Henderson read it twice. Then she said very quietly, He changed it. Yes, Evelyn said. Bill came away from the window and looked at the 2 documents side by side. The set of his face changed, the shame dropping out of it, and something harder and cleaner moving in to replace it. That's fraud. In the legal sense, yes, Evelyn said. The document you signed and the document on file with the county are different. He added a provision after the fact. Cole leaned forward. Bill, I need you to hold on to both of these. Don't do anything with them. Don't say anything to anyone outside this room. Can you do that? What are you going to do? We're going to find out if the other families have the same problem with their copies, Cole said. If they do, if Hale did this to more than one agreement, we have something we can take to a federal investigator. That's a different category of case than civil fraud. Bill looked at him steadily for a long moment. And if you can't stop him before the payments come due? When are your first payments? May. We have time, Cole said. Not a lot, but enough. It was the most direct thing he'd said since they arrived, and it landed the way direct things land when people are frightened, like something solid in uncertain ground. Not a promise exactly, but a statement of intention from a man whose intentions had always been worth something. Ruth Henderson put her hand flat on the table over the 2 documents. What do you need from us? Your copy, Evelyn said, and your silence, for now. You can have both, Ruth said. But they rode back toward the Calhoun place in the late afternoon, the cold settling in again as the light flattened. Cole rode beside her rather than ahead, which was a small decision that he made without announcing it, and that Evelyn didn't comment on. West next, Cole said. West next, she agreed. If the same alteration is in West's copy, Hale did it systematically. That moves this from opportunistic fraud to a deliberate pattern, federal jurisdiction. I know someone who can help us understand the federal side, Evelyn said. A man in Laramie who was a circuit court clerk. He's not practicing, but he'd know who to contact. Cole looked at her. From Casper? From before Casper. She kept her eyes forward. It's a long story. You don't have to tell it. I know, she said. They rode in silence for a while, the horse's breath clouding in the cold air, the valley spreading out on either side in its winter colors, brown and gray and the white of the north-facing slopes. It was not beautiful exactly, this landscape, but it had a kind of severity that some people learned to read as honest, and Evelyn had always been one of those people. Ruth Henderson trusted you, Cole said, faster than I expected. Women who are holding things together tend to recognize each other, Evelyn said. It's not complicated. He thought about that for a moment, then he said, What you said earlier about your father's land. What about it? Is that why you came here, to Red Hollow? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, I came here because it was far enough, and because Martha Calhoun answered my letter. A pause. I wasn't running toward anything specific. I was putting distance between myself and some things that needed distance. The woman who asked Hargrove about you. Yes. He didn't push further. He'd asked more than he'd meant to, and she'd told him more than she'd probably intended to, and that felt like a reasonable place to stop. The Calhoun place came into view around the last bend, the light in the kitchen window already burning against the gathering dark. Evelyn pulled up near the gate. "Cole," she said. He stopped and looked at her. "Hale's going to find out someone's asking questions, sooner or later. Marsh already knows you looked at the documents." "I know. When he finds out, he doesn't seem like the kind of man who responds by slowing down." "He speeds up," Cole said. "I figured." "So we don't have until May," she said. "We probably have until Marsh tells him, which could be tomorrow." Cole sat with that for a moment. The wind came across the yard and moved through the bare branches of the tree beside the fence and said nothing about how much time anyone had. "I'll go see Wes first thing in the morning," he said. "You talk to your contact in Laramie. Can you write him tonight?" "I can have a letter at Hargrove's before 7. Do that." He picked up his reins. "And Evelyn." She looked at him. "You don't work for me. I want to be clear about that. You came to me, I didn't recruit you. If this gets complicated in ways that put you in a difficult position, you can step back. I won't think less of you for it." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I understand," she said, "but I'm not stepping back." "I didn't think you were," he said. "I just wanted you to know the door was there." She gave him a nod that was neither warm nor cold, simply the acknowledgement of a person who has registered a fact and filed it appropriately. Then she turned and went through the gate toward the barn, and Cole watched her go for a moment before he turned his horse north toward the Mercer Ranch. The cold was solid now, genuine and settled, the kind that would be there in the morning and the morning after that. He rode through it without hunching against it, which was a habit he'd developed over years. Not toughness exactly, more like an acceptance of conditions that weren't going to change because you were uncomfortable. He thought about what Evelyn had said. I wasn't running toward anything specific. I was putting distance between myself and some things that needed distance. He recognized that. He recognized it more than he'd expected to, and he sat with the recognition for a while as he rode, not quite sure what to do with it, the way you sit with information that arrives before you have a place to put it. The Mercer Ranch came into view with its lights burning in the bunkhouse and the barn, his hands going about the evening work, the operation running the way it ran because it had been built to run without his constant intervention. He dismounted and handed the horse to the nearest hand and went inside, and he sat down at his desk and looked at the notes he'd made from Evelyn's notebook, and he thought about timing and risk and the particular kind of danger that comes not from open hostility, but from a man who smiles at you while he moves pieces you can't see. He thought, we don't have long. He picked up a pen and started writing down what he knew. Marsh told Hale on a Thursday. Cole didn't know this for certain, but he knew it the way you know weather is coming, by the way things moved differently on Friday morning. One of his hands mentioned seeing 2 men on horseback out past the north fence line, men who didn't belong to any operation in the valley. By afternoon, word reached him through Danny Pratt that Hale had canceled his scheduled meeting with the Delaney family and left the boarding house early without saying where he was going. Cole rode to the Calhoun place before supper. Evelyn was in the barn finishing the evening feeding when he came in. She looked at his face and set down the feed bucket. "He knows," she said. "He knows someone's asking. I don't think he knows what we have yet. He'll move the auction up." Cole leaned against the barn door. The annual spring cattle auction, the largest event in the Valley calendar, where every significant rancher and buyer in the territory came together, had been scheduled for late April. It was the kind of gathering where a public exposure would carry maximum weight, where the presence of outside buyers and regional representatives made it harder to suppress or contain. Evelyn had proposed it 2 weeks ago as their best venue, and Cole had agreed. He could move it, or he could move the default timelines, Cole said. If he amends the agreements before we can challenge them, he can't amend without the signatories' consent, Evelyn said. Not legally. If he tries, that's another instrument of fraud. Legally is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Silas Marsh is his man. If Marsh processes amended documents, then we need Marsh not to be his man anymore. She picked up the bucket again and finished the feeding with the focused economy of someone thinking through a problem while her hands did something else. Did you get a reply from my contact in Laramie? Came this morning. He's given us a name. A federal land investigator named Garrett, who works out of the Denver office. He says Garrett's been watching this territory and would be interested in what we have. Cole paused. He's 3 days out by fast mail. We write him tonight. Already did, but 3 days to receive, whatever time he needs to move. We're looking at 10 days minimum before he arrives, if he comes at all. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted in their stalls, and the barn smelled like hay and cold air and the particular damp warmth of animals in winter. We need to go public before Hale can bury the documents, she said. If we wait for Garrett and Hale gets to Marsh first, the amended copies become the official record. Then we're arguing against documents with documents, and that takes months in court while people lose their land. So we move the auction. She looked at him. We move the auction. You understand what that means. If we call people together before we have federal backing, before we have anything beyond 2 copies of a document and a pattern from other territories. I know what it means, she said. It means we put ourselves in front of everyone in the valley with what we have, and we make the case, and we live with how it lands. Cole looked at her steadily. This was the part of the plan that had been sitting unspoken between them for days. The part where the careful, methodical work of gathering evidence crossed into the exposed territory of public action, where being wrong or unprepared had consequences that couldn't be walked back. There are men in this valley who will side with Hale regardless, he said, not because they believe him, because they've already decided which way the wind is blowing. I know. And if we call the auction early without a good reason, Hale will know exactly what we're doing. He won't just sit there. No, Evelyn said. He'll send those riders. Cole went quiet. Outside the barn, the wind moved across the yard, steady and low. He'd been thinking about the 2 men on the north fence line all day. Their presence, what it implied about the level of response Hale was willing to deploy when he felt threatened. We'd need the auction in 3 days, Cole said. I can make that happen. I know every rancher in the valley, and I can get word to the buyers who matter, but 3 days doesn't give us time to be careful about any of this. We're past careful, Evelyn said. Careful was last week. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, All right, but I need you to understand something. If this goes wrong, if Hale's men show up and the crowd turns, if we can't hold the room, it's not just us. The Hendersons, the Wests, everyone who came forward, they're exposed. I know, she said. I've thought about that. And? She set the bucket down and faced him fully. And I think that the Hendersons and the Wests and every family in this valley who signed one of Hale's agreements is already exposed. We're not putting them in danger. They're already in it. The only question is whether they face it with evidence or without. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll start sending word tonight. The next 3 days had a specific quality that Evelyn would remember for a long time afterward. Not dramatic exactly, but compressed, the way time compresses when every hour contains decisions that can't be unmade. She wrote letters, and Cole rode, and between them they reached 12 ranching families in the valley and asked for their presence at the auction grounds on Monday, without explaining more than that it was urgent and that Cole Mercer was asking. Cole's name did most of the work. She'd noticed early that his reputation functioned like a currency in the valley, not flashy, not freely spent, but accumulated over years and therefore worth something real. When he asked people to show up, they showed up without needing the full story, because they'd learned that when Cole Mercer thought something was worth their time, it generally was. The Wests had come forward on the second day. Their copy of the agreement had the same alteration as the Hendersons, the added default clause added after signing, in language slightly different from the original body of the document. Cole had taken both documents and locked them at the Mercer Ranch in the strongbox where he kept his own deeds. On Saturday evening, Evelyn went to see Martha. Martha was at the kitchen table with her own ledger open, doing the calculations she did every week with the careful attention of someone who had learned that ignoring numbers didn't change them. She looked up when Evelyn came in and read her face with the accuracy of someone who'd been watching her for months. "Sit down," Martha said. "Tell me." Evelyn sat. She told her everything. Not the version she'd been giving people in pieces, calibrated for what they needed to know, but the full picture. The Laramie documents, the Henderson and West copies, the auction plan, the federal investigator who might or might not arrive in time, the two riders on Cole's fence line. Martha listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" Martha said. "I need you to be there Monday," Evelyn said, "and I need you to know that it might get ugly." "I've been at ugly things before." Martha closed her ledger. "Will Cole be able to hold the room?" "He can hold his side of it. Hale will have people there too." "Hale will be there himself," Martha said. "He won't send men to handle something this size. He'll want to manage it personally." She paused. "He's the kind of man who believes he can talk his way out of anything if he's in the room." "He might be right," Evelyn said. "He's very good at it." "What's your plan if he is? If he starts working the crowd and people start wavering?" Evelyn looked at her hands. "The documents," she said. "Everything comes back to the documents. If I can get them in front of people before Hale gets control of the narrative, he'll try to discredit you," Martha said. "You personally. He'll find out what he can about where you came from, and he'll use it." Evelyn looked up. Martha was watching her with the level expression of someone who is not trying to hurt you, but also not willing to let you walk into something unprepared. "I know," Evelyn said. "Does Cole know? About Casper? About whatever brought you here?" A pause. "Not the details." Martha was quiet for a moment. "You should tell him. Before Monday. He shouldn't be standing next to you in that room and find out something about you the same time everyone else does. That's not fair to him." Evelyn sat with that. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing against the house with a low, continuous pressure. "You're right," she said finally. "I usually am," Martha said, without particular satisfaction. "It's more a burden than a blessing, most days." Oh, she went to the Mercer Ranch on Sunday afternoon. Cole was in the yard splitting wood when she rode up, the kind of physical work he retreated to when he was thinking through something complicated. He set the axe down when he saw her and waited. She told him about Casper. Not everything. Some of it wasn't relevant, and some of it was still too close. But the parts that could be used. The man she'd worked for who'd turned out to be dishonest in ways she hadn't understood until she was already inside the situation. The investigation that had named her as a person of interest before it eventually cleared her. The woman who'd been asking about her at Hargrove's, who worked for that man and who had reasons to want Evelyn somewhere she couldn't cause problems. Cole listened the way he listened to most things, without visible reaction, giving it the full weight of his attention. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is any of it true? The things they said about you?" "No." "Then it's not relevant to Monday." "Hale might make it relevant." "He can try," Cole said. "It'll be my job to make sure the room is looking at the documents and not at you when he does." He picked up the axe and set another log. "Anything else?" She looked at him. He had the particular quality, in that moment, of someone who had been given information and processed it and placed it in the appropriate category and was ready to move forward. Not dismissive. He'd heard her, just done with the part that didn't require further discussion. "No," she said. "That's everything." "All right." He split the log, set the pieces aside. "Get some sleep tonight. Monday's going to be long. The auction grounds were a wide, flat expanse east of town that served the valley's largest gatherings. By 9 in the morning on Monday, there were 40 people there, ranchers, buyers, a few townspeople who'd heard something was happening and come to see. The buyers from outside the valley had come because Cole Mercer had personally asked them, and Cole Mercer's word on a cattle gathering was reliable enough to move men 3 days' ride. Leonard Hale arrived at 9:15 with 2 men flanking him who were not buying cattle. He took in the crowd with a quick professional scan, and something in his expression shifted when he saw Cole and Evelyn standing together near the front. Just a flicker, there and gone. Then he put on the smile that Evelyn had come to understand as his working face, warm, confident, the smile of a man who believes the situation is still manageable. Cole called the gathering to order. He was not a man who spoke in public often, which meant when he did, people paid attention. "I've asked you all here because there's something the valley needs to hear before it goes any further," he said. His voice was level, without theater, which made it land heavier than volume would have. "Some of you have signed agreements with Leonard Hale in the past 2 months. Investment agreements, he called them. I want to show you what those agreements actually say." Hale stepped forward. "Cole." His voice was smooth. "I appreciate the concern, but these agreements are between consenting adults who reviewed. The agreements on file with the county recorder," Cole said, "are not the same as the agreements the families signed." That landed. He could see it move through the crowd. A shift in attention, the particular stillness that comes when people suddenly understand that something important is happening. He nodded to Evelyn. She moved to the table she'd set up to the side and spread the documents, the Henderson's copy and the recorder's copy, side by side, and beside them the West family's copies in the same arrangement. She'd written the key differences out on separate sheets in large, clear handwriting, so anyone who came to look could read them without needing to parse legal language. "The default clause in the Henderson agreement," she said, pitching her voice to Carrie, "does not appear in the version filed with the county. It was added after the family signed. The same clause appears in the West agreement, also absent from the county record." Hale moved fast. He was at the table before she finished the second sentence, reaching for the documents. Cole's hand came down on the documents first. The two men who'd come with Hale moved. They were positioning themselves, not drawing, not yet, but moving in a way that was meant to be visible, that was meant to communicate what the next step could be. The crowd saw it. The shift in the room was immediate and physical. Men who'd been standing loose coming to attention. The particular reorganization of bodies that happens when people decide which side of something they're on. Bill Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. He was not a large man or a dramatic one, but he walked to the table and stood beside Cole with the deliberate quality of someone who has decided to stop being afraid of something. "That's my signature," he said, "on both of those pages. And those pages aren't the same." George West came forward next without being asked. "Mine too." 3 other ranchers moved toward the table. Not all of them had signed Hale's agreements. Some of them were simply men who had known Cole Mercer for a decade and had made their calculation about where they stood. Hale looked at the room. He looked at the documents. He looked at Evelyn, and his working expression dropped for just a moment, and what was underneath it was not anger exactly, but something colder and more calculating. The look of a man reassessing his position. "This is a misrepresentation," he said. His voice was still controlled, still professional. "The documents were filed correctly. Any differences are clerical. Clerical errors don't add liability clauses," Evelyn said. She held his gaze. "The clause in question expands the definition of default to include any reduction in property value. It doesn't appear in the recorded version. That's not a clerical error. That's fraud." "Who are you?" Hale said. He said it the way people say it when they've decided to make the person in front of them the issue rather than what they're saying. "You arrived in this valley 2 months ago with nothing. Nobody knows where you came from or why. And you're standing here making legal accusations." "The documents are the accusation," Cole said. His voice was flat. "She didn't write them. You did." Hale looked at him. "Cole, you're a smart man. Think about what you're doing here. You're making enemies you don't need based on the word of a woman you barely know, about matters that—" "I've seen the Laramie records," Cole said. 4 previous territories, same pattern, different name, same instrument." He paused. "L.H. Crane." The name hit. Hale's composure held, but barely. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness that was different from the controlled stillness of before. One of his men moved his hand to his coat. It was Danny Pratt, of all people, who said loudly, and from the back of the crowd, "Don't!" He was 22 years old, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, but he said it, and a dozen men around him adjusted their stances in ways that made the arithmetic clear. The moment held. It was the kind of moment that has no clean ending, too many people, too much accumulated tension, no single gesture that resolves it. Hale looked at the room, and the room looked back at him. And what he saw there was the particular expression of people who have decided, which is one of the hardest things in the world to argue with. He looked at Evelyn one more time. Something in that look was almost professional. An acknowledgement, not of defeat yet, but of a significantly changed situation. Then he said to no one in particular, "This isn't over," and walked out of the auction grounds with his two men behind him. The crowd was quiet for a moment after he left. Then Ruth Henderson said, to no one in particular, "Somebody better ride for Laramie." "Already sent for a federal investigator," Cole said. "He should be here by week's end." People started talking then, all at once, the particular release of a crowd that has been holding its breath. Cole stood at the table and answered questions, and beside him, Evelyn answered the ones he couldn't. And across the grounds, men who'd never spoken to her were speaking to her now, with the directness people use when they've watched someone do something that required something of them. She answered each question carefully and completely, and did not perform confidence she didn't have, because the situation was not over and Hale had been right about that much, and everyone standing there knew it. But the documents were in the open now. The families had seen them. The buyers from outside the valley had seen them. Whatever happened next, that part could not be undone. Martha Calhoun came to stand beside her during a break in the questions. She didn't say anything, just stood there with her coffee, looking at the crowd with an expression that contained several things at once. After a while, she said quietly, "You did good." "We haven't won anything yet," Evelyn said. "No," Martha agreed, "but you changed what it's possible to win." She drank her coffee. "That's not nothing." Evelyn looked out at the auction grounds, at Bill Henderson talking to George West, at Cole fielding questions from a buyer she didn't recognize, at Danny Pratt standing near the entrance with the self-conscious posture of a young man who had just surprised himself. She thought, this is what it looks like before it's finished, unresolved and imperfect and held together by people making the same decision in the same direction at the same time. It was enough, for now. It would have to be. Hale didn't leave this territory. That was the first thing Cole confirmed on Tuesday morning, riding into town early and stopping at the boarding house on the pretense of leaving a message for one of the outside buyers. The landlady, a practical woman named Mrs. Dunn, who missed very little that happened under her roof, told him that Hale and his two men were still in their rooms and had ordered breakfast sent up, which meant they were either planning something or waiting for something, and neither option was comfortable. Cole rode back to the ranch and sent Danny to watch the boarding house from a distance and report any movement. By midday, he understood what Hale was waiting for. A rider came in from the north, and not one of Hale's men, but a messenger carrying papers from a law office in Cheyenne. The papers were served through Silas Marsh's office to the Henderson family and the West family simultaneously, a legal notice asserting that the agreements were valid as recorded, that any claims of document alteration were slanderous and would be pursued accordingly, and that the families were in technical default due to a payment irregularity that had been noted in the original filing. Bill Henderson showed up at the Mercer Ranch an hour later with the notice in his hand and an expression that had gone gray around the edges. "Payment irregularity," he said. "I've made every payment. I have receipts." Cole looked at the notice. It was professionally drafted, specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to require legal interpretation, the kind of document that was designed not to win in court, but to cost money and time to fight. "This is delay," Cole said. "He's trying to run out the clock before Garrett gets here." How long does responding to this take?" "Depends on whether we have a lawyer." Cole set the notice on his desk. "I'm going to reach out to the man Evelyn knows in Laramie. He's not practicing, but he'll know someone who is." Bill sat down heavily in the chair across from Cole's desk. He was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they've been carrying something for so long that the act of sitting down makes the weight more apparent. "Ruth asked me last night," he said, "what happens if this doesn't work? If the investigator doesn't come, or he comes, and it's not enough? What do we do then?" Cole looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." A pause. "That's the first time I've told her I didn't know something in about 20 years of marriage. She took it better than I expected. Sometimes that's the right answer. It doesn't feel right." Bill picked at the edge of the legal notice. "I'm 50 years old. That land is everything I've built. If he takes it..." He stopped. Cole let the silence sit for a moment, not because he didn't have things to say, but because some silences need to exist before the words in them mean anything. He's not going to take it, Cole said then. Not as reassurance, as a statement of intention, but I need you to hold steady for the next few days. Don't respond to that notice yet. Don't talk to Marsh. Don't let Ruth talk to anyone who might carry word back to Hale. How many days? Garrett should be here by Thursday, maybe Friday at the latest. Cole paused. Can you hold that long? Bill Henderson looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who'd built what he had without shortcuts, and they showed it, scarred and thick and capable. I can hold, he said. Good. Cole stood. Go home to Ruth. Don't let her see you look the way you look right now. Bill got up and put his hat on. At the door he stopped. Cole, why are you doing this? Hale's not coming after the Mercer Ranch. You're not in danger here. Cole looked at him. You've been my neighbor for 8 years, he said. That's reason enough. It wasn't the complete answer, and they both knew it, but Bill Henderson nodded and went home, and Cole went to write the letter to Laramie. What? Evelyn heard about the legal notices by evening, when Martha came in from town with the news, and the particular expression she wore when something had happened that she'd half expected and had hoped to be wrong about. Evelyn read the copy Martha had obtained from Ruth Henderson and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it. He's not running, she said. No, Martha agreed. The Cheyenne Law Office, that means he has support we haven't seen yet. Someone back east is funding this response. She thought about the briefcase Hale always carried, about the way he'd moved through town in those early weeks, too comfortable, too unhurried, like a man who knew the outcome of a game before it was played. He expected resistance. This is his contingency. Can Garrett do something about a legal notice? Garrett is a federal land investigator, not a court. He can't stop the legal process, but if his investigation produces findings, it changes the context of everything Hale is trying to do through the courts. Evelyn looked at the notice again. The payment irregularity is manufactured. Henderson has receipts. Any honest review would dismiss it. But an honest review takes time, and time is what Hale is buying. Martha sat down. So what do you do? I need to talk to Marsh. Martha looked at her sharply. Silas Marsh is Hale's man. He was Hale's man when Hale looked like he was going to win, Evelyn said. Monday changed the picture. Marsh is a county recorder, not a criminal. He may not have understood the full extent of what he was facilitating. If he has any sense of self-preservation, and I think he does, he'll want to get clear before the federal investigator arrives. Yes. Martha was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. He'll be scared. Scared is useful, Evelyn said. Scared people make decisions. I'd rather he be scared of what's coming than comfortable with what he's already done. You want to go tonight? Tomorrow morning, early, before Hale is moving. Evelyn looked at Martha. Don't tell Cole. Why? Because Cole will want to come, and if Cole comes, Marsh will manage the conversation toward Cole instead of having it with me. He respects Cole too much to be honest with him. She paused. He'll be more honest with someone he's slightly underestimated. Martha considered her for a long moment. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since Monday, Evelyn said. Since the look on Marsh's face when Cole walked out of his office and Marsh went to his desk and stayed there for a very long time. You saw that? I was in the street. I saw through the window. She folded the legal notice and set it aside. He's not comfortable with where he is. I want to give him a door. Silas Marsh arrived at his office at 7:30 in the morning, which Evelyn knew because she'd been waiting on the bench across the street since 7. She gave him 5 minutes to settle, then crossed and knocked. He opened the door and his face went through 3 different expressions in fast succession before settling on something cautious. Miss Hart. Good morning, she said. I'd like to talk to you. It won't take long. He looked up and down the street with the instinct of a man checking whether he's being watched. The street was mostly empty. He stepped back and let her in. She didn't sit down, and she didn't soften her opening. She'd found over the years that directness worked better with frightened people than gentleness did. Gentleness left too much room to maneuver. The federal investigator arrives Thursday, she said. His name is Garrett. He's been watching this territory for 2 years. When he gets here, the first thing he'll do is look at the documents filed through this office. Marsh stood behind his desk. His hands were flat on the surface, which was a position people took when they wanted something to hold on to. "I file what I'm given," he said. "That's my job." "You filed documents that had been altered after signing," Evelyn said. "Whether you knew they'd been altered or not, your name is on the filing. That makes you the first question Garrett asks." She paused. "It doesn't have to be the only thing you are in this situation." Marsh looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, the defensive posture dropping slightly, the way it drops when someone has been waiting for a particular conversation to arrive and is relieved in a grim way that it finally has. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Evelyn said. "I'm telling you that there's a difference between a man who was deceived by a fraud and a man who participated in one. Garrett will understand that difference. The Cheyenne Law Office that Hale hired will not care about it at all when they're looking for someone to absorb the legal exposure." Marsh sat down. He looked at the desk in front of him for a long moment. "He told me it was a standard filing," he said quietly. "He brought me the documents himself. Said there'd been a last-minute amendment both parties had agreed to verbally, and that the written version just needed to reflect it." He paused. "He gave me $200. "I know," Evelyn said. Marsh looked up sharply. "Not specifically," she said, "but men like Hale always pay the person at the filing office. It's part of the mechanism." She waited a moment. "The question is what you do now." "What can I do now?" "You can give Garrett an accurate account of what happened, including the $200, including exactly what Hale told you, and when." She held his gaze. "A witness who comes forward before the investigation arrives is in a different position than one who gets cornered by it afterward." Marsh was quiet for a long moment. The office was cold despite the small stove in the corner, and it smelled like paper and ink and the particular staleness of a room that was lived in by one person for too many hours a day. "He'll know I talked," Marsh said. "His men are still in town." "By Thursday they won't be," Evelyn said. "If Garrett comes in with your account, Hale's position collapses. His men know the difference between a situation that pays and one that doesn't." "And if Garrett doesn't come?" "He's coming," Evelyn said. "I've seen his confirmation in writing." She paused. "Marsh, I'm not your enemy. I'm the person who's giving you the choice before you run out of time to make it." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The calculation, the fear, the relief that was underneath the fear. The thing underneath the relief that might have been something like wanting to not be on the wrong side of this anymore. "All right," he said finally. His voice was tired. "All right. I'll talk to Garrett." "Write down what you remember," Evelyn said. "Dates, amounts, what was said. The more specific, the more useful." She moved toward the door. "Don't tell Hale we spoke. Don't change anything in the records. Just leave everything exactly as it is and wait for Thursday." She left him sitting at his desk and walked back down the main street of Red Hollow in the early morning cold, and she didn't let herself feel the relief until she'd turned the corner and was out of anyone's line of sight. Then she stood still for a moment and breathed. Why? She told Cole that evening. She told him all of it. Marsh's admission, the $200, the account he'd agreed to give. Cole listened. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You did that alone," he said. "It needed to be done a specific way." "I understand why you didn't bring me." He wasn't angry, exactly. Something more complicated. A man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he'd thought he had mapped. "What you got from him changes everything. If he testifies to Garrett about the $200 and about what Hale told him, the altered documents become part of a documented bribery scheme, not just a filing discrepancy." "That was the idea," Evelyn said. "He'll hold?" "I think so. He's more scared of what's coming than of Hale." She paused. "He's not a bad man. He made a bad decision for $200 and has been living with it in that cold office ever since." Cole looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him thinking something he hadn't yet decided to say. She'd noticed it first at the kitchen table on the day she'd come to him with her notebook, and she'd noticed it several times since. The quality of a man whose thought process moved slowly and honestly, without the performance of certainty. "What?" she said. "I'm thinking," he said, That you walked into that office alone and did something that most people in this valley with twice your standing here would have been afraid to attempt. I was afraid, she said. I was afraid the whole time. I know, that's not what I said. He picked up his coffee and looked at it. Being afraid and doing it anyway isn't something you can teach a person. They either have it or they don't. She looked at him. Are you trying to tell me something? Probably, he said. I'm not sure I'm ready to do it cleanly. She almost smiled at that. Take your time. He did. He sat with it for a moment in the particular silence he was comfortable with, the kind that had content in it rather than avoidance. I've been alone for a long time, he said finally, and I got used to it in a way that convinced me it was what I wanted. There's a difference between wanting something and having accommodated its absence for so long you forgot to tell the difference. He looked up. You've been here 3 months. I've known you for less time than that. I'm not saying this is anything certain. It's not certain, Evelyn agreed. But I'm saying I notice the difference between the room when you're in it and when you're not. And that's more than I've noticed about anyone in a long time. He set down the coffee. That's what I'm trying to say. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a romantic figure in that moment. He was tired from 3 days of tension. His coat was dirty from the morning's work, and he delivered what was essentially a significant personal admission with the verbal grace of a man much better at splitting wood than talking about feelings. She found to her own mild surprise that she didn't mind any of it. I notice it too, she said. For what it's worth. He nodded. Neither of them said anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else ready to be said yet. And they were both people who didn't say things before they were ready. But Garrett arrived on Friday, not Thursday. He was a compact man of about 50, with a civil servant's economy of manner and a lawyer's habit of asking the question behind the question. He came with a deputy and a leather satchel of documentation that suggested he'd been building a case on this territory for longer than anyone in Red Hollow had known. He met with Cole first, then Evelyn, then Marsh separately, privately, for 2 hours, at the end of which Marsh came out looking exhausted, but somehow lighter, the way people look when they've put down something heavy. He met with the Henderson and West families and reviewed the documents. He met with 3 of the outside buyers from the auction who'd stayed in the valley specifically because they understood that what was happening had implications for the territory's land market. On Saturday afternoon, 2 of Hale's men left town quietly, without goodbyes. Hale himself left on Sunday morning. There was no announcement. Mrs. Dunn at the boarding house said he'd paid his bill at 6 a.m. and left with his briefcase in one bag, and that was the last anyone in Red Hollow saw of him directly. Garrett assured Cole that leaving the territory didn't end the federal matter. It usually means they've been told by their lawyers to stop making things worse, he said, with the dry detachment of someone who'd seen this particular exit many times. It's not the end, but it's close to it. The legal notices sent to the Hendersons and the Wests were challenged and subsequently withdrawn. The agreements themselves were declared void pending investigation. The families got their deeds back from the recorder's office, and Silas Marsh filed the corrected documents with the careful precision of a man who understood he was being watched. It wasn't clean. It wasn't fast. There were months still ahead of paperwork and legal process and the ongoing federal case that would eventually produce charges against Hale, Leonard Hale, also known as L.H. Crane, and several associated parties. Nobody in the valley would have described the resolution as satisfying in the way that stories are satisfying, because real resolutions rarely are. They're partial and procedural, and they leave residue. But the land stayed with the families. That was the part that mattered. On the Sunday evening after Hale left, Cole rode out to the Calhoun place. He didn't have a particular reason beyond wanting to tell Evelyn himself that Hale was gone, because it seemed right that she hear it from him rather than through the town's ordinary channels. She was sitting on the fence near the barn when he rode up, looking east at the hills in the last of the afternoon light. She turned when she heard the horse. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is Garrett confident?" "About the charges, yes. About the timeline, less so. He said these things take a year, sometimes more. But the families are safe. For now, yes." She looked back at the hills. The light was going orange at the edges, the kind of light that makes the frontier look like something other than what it daily is. like something that chose to be beautiful rather than just surviving. It wasn't enough, she said. Not a complete enough win. He'll do this somewhere else. Garrett's job is to stop that from happening, Cole said. I know. A pause. I just want to be honest about what it is. It's enough for the Hendersons, Cole said. It's enough for the Wests. He paused. It's enough for Red Hollow. She turned to look at him then. He was sitting on his horse in the fading light, looking back at her with the steadiness that was his most fundamental quality. Not certainty, not invulnerability, just the deep-running patience of a man who has decided to remain. Are you staying for supper? She asked. If Martha's offering. Martha always offers, Evelyn said. She just makes you ask. She climbed off the fence and walked toward the house, and Cole dismounted and tied his horse and followed her. And behind them the hills went dark in their ordinary way, indifferent to human outcomes, and the valley settled into its evening sounds. Wind, cattle, the particular quiet that is not the absence of noise but its most honest form. Winter broke slowly, the way it always did in the valley. Not a single warm day that announced spring, but a gradual loosening, the ground softening at the edges before the middle gave, the light coming back in increments small enough that you only noticed them when you compared a Tuesday to the Tuesday 2 weeks before it. Evelyn noticed. She'd spent enough winters in enough difficult places to have learned that paying attention to small improvements was not optimism. It was a survival skill. You watched for the increments because they were evidence that the hard thing was ending, and evidence mattered more than hope. March came in cold and left milder. By April, the Henderson cattle were grazing on the south pasture again, and Bill Henderson had repaired the fence that had failed in the winter with the particular thoroughness of a man who intended it to hold this time. He'd asked Evelyn to look at the post placement, and she had, and they'd spent an afternoon working through it together while Ruth brought coffee at intervals and pretended not to be watching them with the warm, pragmatic satisfaction of someone whose assessment of a person had been confirmed. The federal case against Hale, Leonard Hale, also named in Garrett's documents as Lawrence Harold Crane, which turned out to be his given name and the source of the LH that had appeared in the Laramie records, moved with the slowness that Garrett had predicted. There were filings and responses and the procedural machinery of a federal investigation that ground forward regardless of whether anyone in Red Hollow was paying attention to it. Garrett sent updates through the mail at intervals, competent and dry, the kind of correspondence that communicated progress without drama. What mattered to the Valley, more than the legal proceedings, was the corrected deed records. Marsh had filed them in early March, every one of the altered agreements voided and the original property titles restored, clean and unencumbered. He'd done it without being asked twice. He'd also, in a development nobody had entirely expected, provided a written account of every interaction he'd had with Hale from the beginning, including details that implicated 2 additional parties from the Cheyenne Law Office in the original scheme. Marsh remained the county recorder. He was not comfortable in the role in the way he'd been comfortable before, but discomfort, Evelyn had observed, sometimes produced better work than ease. He checked documents twice now. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. He was not forgiven, exactly, by the Valley's opinion. Forgiveness was a slower process and depended on time more than action, but he was functional, and functionality was what the Valley required. The 3 families who'd abandoned their homesteads in the winter did not all come back. One returned in April, the Carmichaels, who'd gone to stay with family and had found, after 2 months, that they preferred their own difficulty to borrowed comfort. The other 2 had moved on entirely, and their land sat empty through the spring with the particular vacancy of abandoned places, structures still standing but no longer inhabited, the small disorder of departure rather than the larger disorder of collapse. There was nothing to be done about that. Some losses are past the point where they can be addressed by any amount of correct action, and recognizing that without falling into the belief that nothing can be addressed, that was the particular discipline the Valley was learning. It was Martha who first said, to Evelyn directly, what the town had been saying around corners for 2 months. They were in the kitchen in early April, a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day that feels like the week drawing breath before continuing. Martha was mending something. Evelyn was writing a letter to her contact in Laramie. He had written to say the federal case was proceeding well, and that Garrett had found 2 additional affected territories where Hale had operated under other names. People talk about you differently now, Martha said, without looking up from her mending. I know, Evelyn said. Not differently as in better, exactly. Differently as in real, like you're a person who exists in the place rather than a person who arrived in the place. She paused. There's a distinction. I know that too, Evelyn said. Martha glanced up. Does it feel like anything, being seen differently? Evelyn thought about the question honestly, which was the only way Martha tolerated questions being answered. It feels strange, she said. I spent a long time being invisible in places and learning to function inside that. Being visible it takes adjustment. Do you want it, being visible here? Evelyn set down her pen. Outside the window, the pasture was green at the edges, the first real green of the season, and Sal the horse was moving across it with the unhurried intention of an animal who had opinions about grass. Yes, she said. I think I do. I didn't know that when I arrived. Most people don't know what they want from a place until the place has required something of them, Martha said. That's not wisdom, that's just how it works. She went back to her mending. Evelyn went back to her letter, and the afternoon continued in its quiet way, ordinary and sufficient. Cole came by on a Thursday in late April with the specific purposefulness that Evelyn had learned to read as him having decided something. She was in the yard with Sal, checking the mare's left foreleg, which had been slightly off since Monday. She looked up when she heard Cole's horse on the road, and she stayed where she was with her hand on Sal's leg, watching him ride in. He tied up, came over, and looked at the leg she was examining. What's wrong with her? Not sure yet. Might be the hoof. Might be higher up. She stood and patted Sal's neck. I think it's the hoof. There's a stone bruise under the frog. She'll need a few weeks off the hard ground. I know. Martha's not going to like it. She looked at Cole. What's on your mind? He took his hat off and held it. This was, she had learned, what he did when he was going to say something he'd prepared. It was one of his tells, and she'd never mentioned it to him, and she suspected he'd be mildly mortified to know she'd noticed. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want to be clear that it's a real question, I'm not asking because I think I know the answer. I'm asking because I genuinely don't. All right, she said. Are you staying? In Red Hollow. She looked at him. The question was more specific than it appeared, and they both knew it, and the knowing was part of why he'd had to prepare it. I've been thinking about it, she said honestly. Martha's offered me a more permanent arrangement, a share of the place, not just wages. She paused. It's a real offer. She means it. I know she does. He was watching her with the patient steadiness that was his most consistent quality. Is that enough to keep you here? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the woman who'd asked after her at Hargrove's, who she hadn't heard from since January. She thought about Casper and the life before Casper, and all the distances she'd put between herself and things that needed distance. She thought about what it felt like to stand in the auction grounds on a Monday morning with documents in her hands, and know that what happened next would matter to people she'd come to care about. I'm not leaving, she said. That part I know. Okay. He turned his hat in his hands once. I want to ask you something else then, and this one, he stopped. This one I'm less certain how to say. Say it however it comes out, she said. I don't need it to be clean. He looked at her. I want to build something here, not just the ranch. I've been building that alone for 11 years, and that's its own thing. I mean something larger, the kind of thing that requires two people who have decided they're in the same direction. He paused. I'm asking if you'd consider being in that with me. It was not a polished proposal. It had no flourish to it, no performed romance. It was the statement of a man who had thought about something seriously and was putting it forward as directly as he knew how, with full awareness that he could be wrong about the answer. She stood for a moment with her hand still on Sal's neck, feeling the horse's warmth and the April air and the particular quality of the moment, real and imperfect and fully present in the way that genuine things are. I'm not easy to be around, she said. I keep my own counsel. I'll disagree with you when I think you're wrong. I know all that, Cole said, and you're not easy either. You close off when things get difficult, and you'd rather work through a problem alone than say you need help. He considered this. That's fair. I'm not saying no, she said. I'm saying that's what it actually is, if we're being honest about it. I know what it is, he said. I've watched you for 4 months. I'm not asking for something easy. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the April sun with his hat in his hand, looking back at her with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and is prepared to live with whatever follows. And she thought, this is a person who means what he says. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but genuinely. Then yes, she said, I'll consider it. She paused. I'm already considering it. That's the honest answer. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not the release of someone who'd been holding their breath, more the small, visible relaxation of a person who had taken a risk and found the ground solid beneath it. All right, he said. That's enough for now. It's enough for now, she agreed. He put his hat back on. Martha's going to need another horse while Sal rests. I'll send Danny with the bay mare tomorrow. She'll argue about accepting it, Evelyn said. I know. That's why I'm sending Danny. She argues less with Danny. Evelyn almost smiled. That's because Danny looks like her youngest son. Cole looked at her. How do you know that? She told me. One evening in March, when she'd had more coffee than usual, she turned back to Sal and ran her hand down the leg again, gently. She misses him. He's in Kansas. She doesn't say so, but you can tell. Cole watched her work with the horse for a moment. Then he said, You pay attention to people. People are worth paying attention to, she said. He rode out 20 minutes later, and Evelyn stood in the yard and watched him go, and she thought about what had just been decided and what it meant and how strange it was that the things you couldn't have predicted, the ones that arrived without announcement, dressed in work clothes, carrying no particular promise, were sometimes the ones that changed the shape of everything. There's something worth saying, at this point in the telling, about what the Valley learned that winter and spring, not as a lesson exactly. The frontier was not a classroom, and its inhabitants were not students, and reducing what people lived through to instruction feels like a disservice to the actual weight of it. But there is something true underneath the events of those months that deserves to be named directly, because it's the kind of truth that gets obscured when stories are told cleanly. What Red Hollow learned was not that good people always win, or that corruption always fails, or that the right person always arrives at the right time. None of those things are reliably true. What the Valley learned, imperfectly and incompletely, was something more specific, that isolation is a vulnerability. Not the isolation of geography, they'd always known that, had built lives around it, but the isolation of people who believe they have to hold everything alone, who confuse self-sufficiency with never needing to stand beside someone. Hale had relied on that isolation. He'd approached families one at a time precisely because a family alone is easier to confuse and frighten than families who have looked each other in the eye and decided to be a community rather than a collection of individuals occupying the same landscape. He'd offered each of them a private deal, a quiet arrangement, a secret that separated them from their neighbors. The secrecy was not incidental to the scheme. The secrecy was the scheme. What stopped him, not completely, not cleanly, but enough, was the opposite of secrecy. It was Evelyn bringing her notebook to Cole's kitchen table. It was Cole riding to the Henderson place with someone beside him. It was Ruth Henderson reading documents she'd never have thought to ask for if someone hadn't shown her they existed. It was Danny Pratt, 22 years old and afraid, saying don't to a man whose hand was moving toward his coat, and a dozen men around him shifting their weight in a specific direction. None of these people were exceptional. None of them were without fear or doubt or the pull toward keeping their own heads down and hoping the problem resolved itself. Evelyn had been afraid going into Marsh's office. Cole had been afraid, in his way, of what happened if the auction failed and he'd staked his standing on it. Bill Henderson had sat in a chair at the Mercer Ranch looking at his hands like a man who might be 50 years old and have to start over. They did it anyway. Not because they were brave in some innate way, but because they were there, and the thing needed doing, and they were the people who could do it. Courage, in the genuine version, not the movie version, is almost never dramatic. It's usually just deciding not to stop. The summer that followed was the best the Valley had seen in 3 years, not because of anything singular, No miracle of weather, no sudden prosperity. The Henderson cattle recovered through the spring grazing. The West family replanted what they'd had to leave fallow. The Carmichaels, returned from their exile in their relatives' crowded house, fixed the roof that had been failing for 2 seasons. Small things, accumulated, the way good seasons are actually built. Evelyn was no longer working solely for Martha. By June, she had taken a partial share of the Calhoun operation. Her name on the deed, which Martha had proposed, and the county recorder had processed with the careful correctness of a man earning back something he'd lost. She'd spent 3 weeks in late May with a surveyor reestablishing the Calhoun boundary lines because the existing markers were old and imprecise, and she wanted to know exactly what she was building on. Cole came by often, not with the stated purpose of visiting Evelyn. He came with reasons because he was a practical man who needed reasons, but the reasons had a way of bringing him to the Calhoun place 2 or 3 times a week, and Martha had long since stopped pretending not to notice. One evening in June, Martha came in to find Cole sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, waiting for Evelyn to come in from the barn, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she'd made a decision about something. "You're going to ask her properly," Martha said. It was not a question. Cole looked at her. "That's my intention." "When?" "When it's the right time." "The right time isn't a thing that announces itself," Martha said. "You make it the right time by deciding it is." Cole considered this. "You sound like you've thought about this." "I've watched 2 people I care about dance around something for 4 months," Martha said. "I've had time to think." He was quiet for a moment. "Is she happy here?" Martha sat down across from him. It was a serious question, and she treated it seriously. "I think she's learning to be," she said, "which is different from happy, like a feeling you wake up with. It's more like she's building something here, in herself. And she's not afraid of that process the way she was in January." "What was she afraid of in January?" "Of wanting things," Martha said simply. She'd learned in whatever happened before she came here that wanting things was the fastest way to lose them, so she'd stopped. She looked at the door to the barn. She started again, carefully, but started. Cole held his coffee and said nothing for a moment. Then, "She told you about Casper." "Not all of it. Enough. She told me some," he said. "I didn't push for the rest." "Good," Martha said. "It's hers to tell in her own time." She stood up. "Ask her properly. Don't make a production of it. She won't want a production." "I know," he said. "I know her." Martha looked at him with the straight look she reserved for statements she found significant. "Yes," she said. "I think you do, Sam." He asked her on a Tuesday evening in July, which was not a special day in any way, which was perhaps why it was right. They were walking the fence line on the Calhoun east boundary. She'd wanted to check the markers the surveyor had placed, and Cole had come along because she'd mentioned it, and he'd had no reason not to. The evening was warm and the light was long, the way summer evenings in the valley could be generous with their light, and the hills to the east were the particular color of dry grass in late July, gold and brown together. He stopped at the last marker and she crouched to examine it and pronounced it correctly placed, and when she stood up, he was looking at her with the expression she'd seen in April, the hat in his hands, the prepared quality. "You kept the hat on this time," she said. He looked down at it. "I didn't realize I had a tell." "You've had it since the first day I came to your kitchen table." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to do this properly. Build something together that's ours, not mine, that you're part of, and not yours that I'm adjacent to. Something we decide on together from the start." He held her gaze. "I know that's a large ask. I know you came here with nothing, and you've built something, and I'm asking you to change the shape of it. But I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking if we can make it larger." She stood in the long evening light and looked at him. She thought about all the roads that had led to this particular fence line, the ones she'd chosen and the ones she hadn't had a choice about, the distances she'd put between herself and damage, the letter she'd written to Martha Calhoun in the dark of a difficult winter before she'd known whether it would be answered. She thought about what it had cost her to trust anything again, and she thought about what it had cost to stop. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He didn't move dramatically. He didn't make it into something larger than it was. He put his hat back on and took her hand, and they stood at the boundary marker in the evening light. And that was the shape of it. Not spectacular, not perfect, but real in every detail. Martha's going to be insufferable about this, Evelyn said. She's going to say she knew first, Cole agreed. She did know first. She knows most things first, he said. I've made my peace with it. They walked back toward the house side by side in the fading light, and the valley spread out around them in its ordinary way. Imperfect, demanding, containing within it everything that the two of them were in the slow process of choosing. They married in September, at the Calhoun place, because Evelyn had said she didn't need a church, and Cole had said the land was as good a place as any. It was small and specific to the people present: Martha, the Hendersons, the Wests, Danny Pratt, who stood very straight and took the occasion seriously. Silas Marsh came, which surprised some people and didn't surprise others. Old Pete Granger came from his bench outside the dusty boot and wore a clean shirt and said afterward that he'd known it would happen and had said so, which was not entirely accurate, but was not entirely false either. Garrett sent a letter from Denver that arrived the same week, informing Cole that the federal case had produced indictments against Hale and 3 associated parties from the Cheyenne office. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Families who'd been named in the scheme would be notified to provide testimony. The letter was precise and civil and contained, in its final paragraph, an acknowledgement that the community action taken in Red Hollow had been instrumental in the case's development, that without the documentation secured at the local level, the federal investigation would have had significantly less to work with. Cole read this aloud at the kitchen table the morning it arrived, with Evelyn beside him with her coffee. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He got indicted," she said. "Yes. That's more than I thought we'd get," she said. Not with satisfaction exactly, more with the specific relief of someone who had allowed themselves to hope for a thing and found it had actually happened. "The trial might go badly," Cole said. "Federal juries are unpredictable." "I know." She looked at the letter. "But it's something. It's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She set down her coffee and looked out the window at the morning. The yard, the pasture, Sal moving unhurried across the far end of it, the hills beyond going through their September colors, the particular gold of a season that is ending without apology. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place. Not the legal sense, the deed with her name on it, the marriage that made the Mercer Ranch also hers, but the deeper sense, the one you can't manufacture and can't inherit, the one that gets built out of difficulty and time and the decision, made repeatedly and without guarantee, to stay. She had not known, arriving on a Tuesday morning in November with her bag and no explanations, whether Red Hollow would become that place for her. She had not allowed herself to know. She'd learned through experience that had been expensive in the ways that matter, not to want things before she knew she could hold them. What she understood now, sitting at the kitchen table in the September light, with the federal indictment on the table and Cole across from her and Martha's footsteps on the porch outside, was that belonging is not something that is given to you. It is not granted by acceptance or recognition or any external conferral. It is built, the way fences are built, and foundations are banked and axles are braced in frozen ditches, through the application of what you know to what is in front of you, repeated until the structure holds. She had built it, imperfectly, incrementally, sometimes while afraid, and sometimes while wrong. She had built it, and it held. Outside, Martha came through the door with an armful of something from the garden and set it on the counter and looked at them both with the expression she wore when she was containing something she'd decided not to say. "What?" Evelyn said. "Nothing," Martha said. "I'm not saying a word." "You're clearly thinking something." "I'm thinking several things." She turned back to the counter. "I'm thinking this is a good kitchen for a morning. I'm thinking that letter has good news in it by the look of your faces. I'm thinking—" She paused. "I'm thinking I'm glad I wrote back when you sent that letter in October." Evelyn looked at her. "You almost didn't." "I know," Martha said. "I was tired and the winter was coming and I didn't know if I had room for another person's difficulty." "What made you write back?" Martha was quiet for a moment, doing something with the counter that didn't require the amount of attention she was giving it. "The letter," she said finally, "the way it was written. It wasn't asking for charity, it wasn't performing need. It said you could work and you would, and that you needed somewhere far enough from somewhere else. And I thought," she stopped. "I thought that was the most honest letter I'd read in years. Most people dress up what they're asking for. You didn't." She picked up her armful again and went out to the back porch, and her footsteps receded, and the kitchen was quiet. Cole looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the place where Martha had been, with the expression she wore when something had landed squarely. "She's right, you know," Cole said, "about the honesty." "I didn't think it was particularly honest," Evelyn said. "I thought it was just, I didn't have the energy to pretend." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Cole said. She thought about that. She thought about all the ways that exhaustion had, in the end, been useful, had stripped away the performance of competence and left the actual thing, had made her too tired to dress up what she was asking for, and so she'd asked for it plainly and been surprised by what came back. She was not someone who believed that difficulty happened for reasons, that suffering arranged itself into lessons if you looked at it correctly. She'd seen too much of what difficulty did to people, what it had done to her father, to the Henderson family, to Silas Marsh in his cold office, to find that story convincing. Difficulty was just difficulty. It happened, and you moved through it, or you didn't, and what mattered was the moving. But sometimes, moving through enough of it, you arrived somewhere that was worth the cost of getting there. Not because the cost was necessary, not because it made you better or stronger, or any of the things difficulty is supposed to make people. Just because you kept moving, and the place was there, and you were finally, after a long time, willing to stop. Red Hollow was not a forgiving place. It was cold in the winter and dry in the summer, and it required more than it returned in most years, and the people in it were imperfect in the ways that frontier people are imperfect, worn down and stubborn, and occasionally wrong in ways that cost them. Nothing that had happened in the past year had changed any of that. The valley was not healed or transformed. It was just itself, continuing, with its full complement of difficulty and its occasional, genuine consolations. Evelyn Hart, Evelyn Mercer, now, though she still thought in the old name sometimes, by habit, sat at the kitchen table in the September light and drank her coffee and listened to the sounds of the morning, and felt, with a plainness that required no dramatizing, that she was in the right place. That was enough. In the end, after everything, it was exactly enough.